Hello and welcome to Critical Readings, episode 326 for the, oh dear, what is it going to be? The 15th of June? I forgot to look at my calendar. 2026. I'm getting nods from Lane, so I must be right. I'm Dr. Sean Philip Cooper, and with me today I have the aforementioned Lane Haygood.
Hello, as always.
And the hitherto silent Drew Keene.
Salutations.
Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome to your first video recording, Drew. We are here today, all three of us on screen, live and streaming for those in our Discord channel. And if you'd like to join them, you can head over to criticalreadings.com and click Become a Patron at the top of the page, which will give you access to our Discord channel, where podcasts go live a little bit early, where you can watch the podcast as it is streamed, or listen to it if you prefer. And you can join in chats and discussion forums with other paid subscribers, including polls on readings we'll do in the future. We look forward to seeing you in our Discord. And of course, if you're already a subscriber and you haven't received that email, send a message to critreadings, all one word, at icloud.com, and we will get you set up. Well, today we are going to be looking at the next 5 chapters of the first book of The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which is The Sword and the Stone. But before we get to that, as promised in the last 2 weeks, we're going to be reading reader comments today. And we have some. This is for our first episode on The Once and Future King. You'll have to excuse me as I read it from my telephone here. Disa writes, I'm going to take off my glasses, absolutely loving The Once and Future King so far. Can't believe I let it sit on the shelf for years. Then again, maybe the timing was just right, and I'm glad I have read Mallory already. Yes. A couple of questions I wrote down whilst reading the first part. Were nurses allowed to stay after their work with the children was done, or were they sent on to the next post? Could anyone have hunting birds, or were they considered costly? What does it mean to be in Yark? Finally, I love the description of the sort of sleep that doesn't feel like sleep, but actually is. Quote, at first he only dipped below the surface of sleep, and skimmed along like a salmon in shallow water, so close to the surface that he fancied himself in air. End quote. I look forward to reading the rest for the second week and listen to the discussions. Well, these questions are really good ones, Disa. Were nurses allowed to stay after their work with the children? I mean, they could. Sometimes, if they were particularly aged, they would kind of be kept on by the family in a sort of semi-retirement, as a sort of charity measure, right? The family would pay them a small amount and they would stay around and work as like a sort of domestic. But sometimes they would move on. If they were young and able and they could take on another role, they would proceed onward and nurse some other children. I think I have that right. Yes, Drew?
Well, the question poses a time frame, like when?
Oh, that's a good point. I'm thinking of like Victorian nurses, right, who would frequently be nurses
And
to
the
several.
question with when is really complicated with the Once and Future King, because he often imposes early 20th century British standards onto a Mallorean version of Arthurian times. So we're really dealing with 3 time periods.
Indeed, are we talking the 9th century, the 15th century, or the 20th century? It's difficult to say. Well, yes, if she were a nurse and it were in the 9th century or perhaps even in the 15th century, she would probably have stayed. She would have been a part of the household. But by the 19th and 20th century, the profession had become well professionalized, and so they would move on. A good question. She writes, could anyone have hunting birds, or were they considered costly? Oh, they were costly. You needed someone to, well, as you see with Hob, right? You need someone to basically sit up with them at night and take care of them and train them. And this is a dedicated task. And if you let them go and they get away for a while, they'll become wild again. So it is, you have to have a trained professional to do this. They have to be kept on staff. And you have to get the birds from somewhere, so they need to be caught and they need to be good. So yes, it's not for the ordinary people. Not that it
And just
couldn't be done, but it's unlikely.
the hunting itself was also not something that just anyone could do. I mean, hunting
Especially
was,
in England.
yeah.
Yeah, the land is not. It's not like the national state parks or something today, where if you have a hunting permit, you can go in. The land belongs to the king or the local lord, and if you hunt on it, they'll kill you. That's a capital offense. So you have to have permission, and they don't give permission to ordinary people. They give permission to their friends. And
Incidentally, in the 15th century, the King of England had many castles spread throughout England, precisely because his entire household would be on the land until they had exhausted all of its resources. And then they had to move to another location and then exhaust the resources there. And so they rotated amongst the castles because they were exploiting the resources to the point that there was nothing left.
they would imagine this band, and it's not just the king and his immediate family, it's his court, his retinue, and all the servants needed to support them. You're talking perhaps 200 or 300 people. And they would travel in a large group with all their possessions too. Like the king would have his plate, like his silver plate, his gold. He would take it all with them. These enormous trains would go from house to house, and then they would set up there for several weeks. That's it. Completely exhaust the hunting resources, and then they'd pack it all up again and go on to the next house. And sometimes, if you were particularly unlucky, they'd come to your house.
Right. That's what I'm about to say. If they've decided they don't have enough at any of their houses, then they'll show up at some other lord's house and you can't say no.
History records the real reality of people trying to behave like mad people to drive the king away, where they'd go out and put their underpants on their head and roll around on the ground. And the king's servants would ride up and say, "Oh dear, they've gone mad here. There's something wrong. They're all ill. We'll go to the next house." If it works, right? Oh, and the last question is, what does it mean to be in Yerk? I think that's like the molt, isn't it, Drew?
I think so. Yeah, I'm not extremely
it's
sure.
It's basically the equivalent of heat, I think, something to that effect. And so it makes the male birds particularly aggressive. I think. I haven't looked it up, so you may want to do that, but I believe, or at least reading it, that was the sense I got from context. Thank you for those questions, Disa. Well, on last week's episode, our second episode on the Sword and the Stone and the Once and Future King, we had 3 more comments. Charlie writes, and I think this is our first comment from Charlie, so thank you, Charlie, for writing in. He writes, "It has been almost 2 years to the day that I found the podcast when looking for a reading of Lycidas on Spotify. I was soon hooked by following the Milton trend back to Paradise Lost and have been a dedicated listener since. Rainier Rilke's Sonnets to Orpheus got me hooked on poetry, and your podcast has opened me up to a world of literature I barely knew existed. Thank you so much for the life and literary lessons you have lavished on my learning. I look forward to years more of your liturgy." Well, thank you for that, Charlie. That's very kind, and we hope to have some more Milton for your delectation in the near future.
I'm delighted we not only have another listener and commenter, but also another Miltonian, and Lycidas is one of the best.
Susan writes, "Like Charlie, I am constantly learning new things from critical readings. Having watched Disney's The Sword and the Stone as a child, I always thought Wart was actually being turned into animals. However, after your discussion, it makes much more sense that Merlin was helping him imagine what it would be like to live in different animal societies. In addition to lack of imagination hindering Kay's ability to participate, I think lack of empathy also plays a huge role. Empathy for others is correlated with social status. Kay has no empathy for Wart not being treated as well as he is, as Kay has grown up in the privileged class of nobility. He also lacks the empathy to imagine what it would be like to be an animal. To me, White is showing that people in power need to be both imaginative and empathetic to be good leaders. This is so relevant for today, when so many people seem to have no empathy for others. Yet, certainly empathy is one of the key virtues for White. He really does believe in a sort of compassionate and empathetic approach to rule and to society in general. And that's why his Merlin is a pacifist, and that's why we see the episode with the geese, which kind of closes out the Wart's training. We'll be talking a little bit about that today. So thank you for that, Susan. And we have one more comment from James. Not an Arthurian comment, unfortunately. But as ever, your podcast is indispensable to me. I am working my way through older episodes. There are so many that half the books I pick up have been covered on the show. Well, then you're reading some very good stuff if half the books you pick up are being covered here. Recently, you have helped me process Eliot's 4 quartets, pretty old episodes by now, I know, which always enchanted me but are so dense. In a similar vein, I want to understand William Blake's religious poetry. all his prophecies and such. Would you guys consider doing a short series on the Book of Thel, the marriage of heaven and hell, etc.? Thank you either way for your work. We'll certainly put them on the list, James. It's a very long list. There's so many wonderful works of literature, but Blake is on there. And we also, I should point out, have scheduled a few reader choice episodes for the future for our Discord users, and we'll put some reader suggested text to them on which they can vote, and our Discord users will be able to select the readings for those weeks of the year. So if you'd like to be able to vote on those, you'll need to be in our Discord channel. All right, well, with that, we can now turn our attention to the once and future king. Actually, is it Susan's comment? Is in my mind about Kay. I was thinking about him this morning as we were getting ready for the podcast, and about how Kay isn't really a bad person. And we'll see this particularly in next week's episode. But he is sort of thoughtless and hasty, right? He acts before he thinks, mostly. And when, as we'll see next week, when he is forced to slow down and think about right and wrong, he actually does do what's right, right? But he has this impulse control where he immediately goes for whatever is most self-satisfying, and that's a very dangerous thing to do because often that's what's wrong. Well, let's turn to chapter 14. Last week we had the ants, and as I said last week, I particularly like the ants because they have a sort of fascistic, hive-like, Borg-like existence. And of course, I always thought the Borg were one of the great Star Trek villains, and so the ants are a great T.H. White villain with their collectivist mentality and their inability to even think outside of the terms of their existence, which is what I think is particularly interesting. It's White getting at the way in which language constructs our reality. And he doesn't spend a great deal of time on it, but I think it's important that, basically someone who controls the language you can use can control the things about which you think and even how you think, and set limits on the parameters of your thinking. So language is very important. But in chapter 14, we leave the ants well and truly behind, and we get a sort of idyllic look at Anglo-Saxon England. And just as we read a section of that earlier, I'd like to read this beginning to chapter 14, where it talks about the autumn. We've had the spring, I think. So here's autumn, and we'll have haymaking next week. In the autumn, everybody was preparing for the winter. At night, they spent the time rescuing daddy longlegs from their candles and rushlights. In the daytime, the cows were turned into the high stubble and weeds which had been left by the harvest sickles. The pigs were driven into the purlieus of the forest, where boys beat the trees to supply them with acorns. Everybody was at a different job. From the granary there proceeded an invariable thumping of flails. In the strip fields, the slow and enormously heavy wooden plows sailed up and down for the rye and the wheat, while the sowers swung rhythmically along with their hoffers round their necks, casting right hand for left foot and vice versa. Foraging parties came lumbering in with their spike-wheeled carts full of bracken, remarking wisely that they must get home with ye breeks ere all summer be gone, for tethered-up cattle to sit down upon. While others dragged in timber for the castle fires, the forest rang in the sharp air with the sound of beetle and wedge. Everybody was happy. The Saxons were slaves to their Norman masters if you chose to look at it in one way, but if you chose to look at it in another, they were the same farm labourers who get along on too few shillings a week today. Only neither the villein nor the farm labourer starved when the master was a man like Sir Ector. It has never been an economic proposition for an owner of cattle to starve his cows, so why should an owner of slaves starve them? The truth is that even nowadays the farm labourer accepts so little money because he does not have to throw his soul in with the bargain, as he would have to do in a town, and the same freedom of spirit has obtained in the country since the earliest time. The villeins were labourers. They lived in the same one-roomed hut with their families, few chickens, litter of pigs, or with a cow, possibly called Crumbach. Most dreadful and insanitary, but they liked it. They were healthy, free of an air with no factory smoke in it, and, which was most of all to them, their heart's interest was bound up with their skill in labour. They knew that Sir Ector was proud of them. They were more valuable to him than his cattle even, and as he valued his cattle more than anything else except his children, this was saying a good deal. He walked and worked among his villagers, thought of their welfare, and could tell the good workmen from the bad. He was the eternal farmer, in fact, one of those people who seem to be employing labor at so many shillings a week, but who are actually paying half as much again in voluntary overtime, providing a cottage free, and possibly making an extra present of milk and eggs and home-brewed beer into the bargain. In other parts of Gramarye, of course, there did exist wicked and despotic masters, feudal gangsters, whom it was to be King Arthur's destiny to chasten. But the evil was in the bad people who abused it, not in the feudal system. Well, you don't often see in literature full-throated defense of feudalism, but here's one. And what do we think of it? Drew, I'm going to give it to you because I imagine you're ready to go. What is your view of White's defense of feudalism?
It's a pretty picture, but it's not true. I mean, it's romanticism through and through, and the key is in the last line that you read, which on the page is set off as its own paragraph, as if to draw special attention to it. And this is signaling White as an idealist rather than any kind of materialist. He doesn't think the systems that we inhabit have any kind of force on the way that we see things and the way that we live, on any kind of moral outcomes. He thinks that it's all to do with the ideas and the personal morality of the people who inhabit the systems. So he doesn't think there's anything about feudalism that's uniquely exploitative, simply that there are good feudal lords and bad feudal lords. He also posits the idea that the countryside is more conducive to a good life than the city. So the city, we see this in Wordsworth, right? This is pure romanticism. What he doesn't know, and I can't fault him for not knowing this because it took a while for historians to figure it out, is that capitalism in England, and England is the first place that capitalism emerged, in the 16th century began in the countryside, not in the cities. So that word bourgeois is a little bit of a misnomer because it means a city dweller. But in fact, the system emerged in the countryside when landlords started to impose competitive rents on farmers, as opposed to the customary rents which they weren't allowed to change. Right? So as long as your rent remained stable, then your means of self-reproduction remained stable. But once they started imposing competitive rents, then you have to be more profitable in order to meet the new demand. And then also other landlords have to impose competitive rents because they enter into competition with each other. So this whole logic emerges in the 16th century in the countryside, not in the city.
That's quite right. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention the way in which language constructs our reality is that White seems perfectly happy to understand that. But then we get to the idea of, might not a system of government also construct our society and also constrain the ways that we think about the world? And White doesn't make that leap, right? He can understand that language can be a systemic force that affects the way we view the world, but he doesn't seem to realize that systems of government have a similar effect as well. And of course, he's a writer, first and foremost, so he is preoccupied with language, and so he's probably spent a little bit more time thinking about that. Well, let's move on, if we might. We get Sir Ector, and Sir Ector is the sort of, here we see him as a sort of red-faced, somewhat jolly, he's waving his hands around. It reminds me a bit of Prince Rune in the books by Lloyd Alexander, where he's kind of shouting and carrying on, and no one's really paying attention to him. They're sort of respecting his authority, but it's all right. Like, the whole thing kind of runs without him anyway. And so there he is shouting, "Dang it," right? "Dang it," said Sir Ector. Then, considering the subject more attentively, he added in a loud, indignant voice, "Splendor of God!" He's got a letter, and the letter tells him something very interesting. And it's something we discussed earlier. And it's this: the overlord of the castle of Forest Sauvage is more than a farmer. He's got all these different things, right? He's a master of hounds. And being a master of hounds, he runs a hunt. And having the ability to run a hunt it's very possible that the king might want to come and hunt on his land, and this letter reads, "The king to Sir Ector, etc. We send you William Twitty, our huntsman, and his fellows to hunt in the forest sauvage with our boarhounds, Cannabis nostris porcerisis, in order that they may capture 2 or 3 boars. You are to cause the flesh they capture to be salted and kept in good condition, but the skins you are to cause to be bleached, which they give you, as the said William shall tell you. And we command you to provide necessaries for them, as long as they shall be with you by our command, and the cost, etc., shall be accounted, etc. Witnessed at the Tower of London, 20th of November, in the 12th year of our reign, Uther Pendragon." And now we have White's explanation. The forest belonged to the king, and he had every right to send his hounds to hunt in it. Also, he maintained a number of hungry mouths, what with his court and his army, so that it was natural that he should want as many dead boars, bucks, roes, etc., to be salted down as possible. He was in the right, White tells us. This did not take away the fact that Sir Ector regarded the forest as his forest, and resented the intrusion of the royal hounds, as if his own would not do just as well. So there's pride on the line, in addition to the gross inconvenience of the king sending this jumped up huntmaster. You know, Ector has his own huntmaster. He doesn't want this urbane, court huntmaster who thinks he knows better about the land. Ector lives there, right? So there's this moment of, the pride of the local gentry is being attacked by the imposition of this letter.
You'll also notice 12 Uther,
Indeed.
which is the Norman convention for noting laws, and that the Tower of London is standing. We are here in Norman England. We are not in Saxon England. We are not in British pre-England. This is very much Norman through and through.
It is.
Well, even the fact that Sir Ector doesn't have his own army, right? The Norman conquest brought about a very unique situation for feudalism, in which the nobility were demilitarized very early in England, so that the king was really the law of the land.
Indeed, under the Saxons, the Orls, right? The Earls, as we would call them, they had their own standing militias. They could call it the king could call it the feared, but he would mostly rely on his earls to bring their local militias to basically fight for him, and that's what Harold did in 1066, and it almost worked, almost. And then my ancestors just came along and took care of that. So hooray for the Normans! So the Normans come along and they say, well, we can't have that. We can't have our local lords raising an army, because what if they rebelled? And so, yes, under William, and particularly under William's successor, William Rufus, William II, this was demilitarized very quickly. Now, we should point out, of course, that this, again, jiggers up the timeline, because Arthur's supposedly 8th, 9th century. Well, there were no Normans in England in the 8th and 9th centuries. Certainly, the idea that we'd be having this dating system, 12 Uther, which lasts for a long time, right? I mean, up to almost the present day. Things are still dated in this way. So it's very interesting, because Bede, right, the great 8th century cleric who wrote the history of the church in England, basically, the ecclesiastical history of the English people, was the first person to basically standardize dating from the birth of Christ, right? He said, well, why don't we just do everything that way? This usage of kings and stuff, it's all very confusing. Let's standardize the dating. We'll use these dates, which are now called Bede's Northumbrian dates, and we'll standardize dating. And so that was what was done for a little while, until the Normans came along. We went back to the old way. And then eventually the Normans got on board, and their descendants, I should say, and we went back to Bede's very sensible system. I particularly like what happens with Ector and William Twitty, because this is a very modern thing, and that's why White chooses this. But it is also a very ancient thing. Nobody likes having their authority trod on by some outsider who has some sort of jumped up authority, right? Nobody likes someone swanning into their workplace, like the efficiency experts come into your work, and start telling you how to do things. They don't work there. They don't know why things are done the way they are. They might be, slightly less efficient, but that might be the way that you keep things running, right? And if you impose a more efficient regime, maybe the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. And as I said, it's a very modern concern. It's also a very ancient concern. And I love that White chooses this. It cuts across time. And he gives us a very believable impression of Sir Ector. And he also is quick to step in and say, well, don't side too much with Ector. Your initial response, I think, as a reader is to side with Ector because you like Ector and he's kind of funny, and he's also, we know him to be a good lord rather than a wicked one. But White narratively points out in his narrational voice, no, actually, the king is in the right. I mean, yes, Ector is annoyed and there's a matter of pride on the line, and he thinks it's obnoxious that his own hounds aren't being used, but as the narrator says, the king was in the right. And I want to call attention to this because this narrator, the narrator that White uses, which is really White himself, is not unbiased and is not like some sort of, neutral arbiter. He makes decisions about what is right and what is wrong. And this is what annoys some people who read The Once and Future King, because they don't agree with White, especially later on when he becomes more vociferous about political schemes and about morality. People who don't agree with him find this sort of intrusive, right? But I think we have to give him a fair hearing, and we have to try to understand the sort of morality from which he's speaking, and also understand that he's writing in the intra-war period. And so he's very concerned about the rise of authoritarianism, but also the depredations of the Great War, right, which he considers a massive tragedy. And how do you balance those two things? How do you balance the need to fight a rising fascist and authoritarian force in Germany and elsewhere against the fact that you've just fought a massive war which has, deprived your country and other countries of a generation of men and sent the rest home wounded and maimed? And how do you deal with that, including some of White's friends? That's a difficult balance to strike, and that's what I think leads to some of the contradictions that we'll find in this book.
White is essentially writing a didactic narrative. I mean, he wants to convey these ideas. The story is serving that purpose. So while I understand the frustration, because I think he's wrong about a great deal of his political philosophy and his economic philosophy, but I mean, it's hard to separate out the story from those ideas, because it was those ideas that motivated him to tell the story in the way that he does.
In that way, it's not quite a barnyard fable like Animal Farm, but it is like Animal Farm in that it has a political and didactic motivation, right? That there is an underlying philosophy, and it becomes more pronounced as you get closer to the end, right? In the later volumes, with the exception of The Queen of Air and Darkness, which is a little different. That's more about personal psychology, I guess. It's a book on Freudian psychology. But the other three books are, by and large, although not entirely, by and large, they're about White's political philosophy and also how he's dealing with the events of his own particular moment, which are, they're not sui generis, they do reoccur. We see them before and after, which is why he's able to put the setting in the past and why it still resounds with us in the future. But it is worth noting that it comes out of his time. Well, let's see. I like chapter 15 because it's got these wonderful songs in it. Now, you may dislike it for that reason. I know there are many people who cannot abide Tolkien because of the poetry. Was it someone said Tolkien is great except for the poetry, some great author. And I can't remember who at the moment. But some people love Tolkien for his poetry, right? I think it depends on how tolerant you are of mostly good, but not entirely poetry. And that's Tolkien's poetry in the books. I think his long poetry
it's poetry
is better.
at the ballad level. It's not,
Yeah.
high poetry.
I think we have to understand that the people who are singing poetry in Tolkien are not modern professors of poetry. You know, it's not the poetry they would choose. It's the poetry
They're
of
not
ordinary
T.S.
people.
Eliot.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. It's Sam Gamgee, right, and Frodo, and Bilbo, and they're not T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound for that matter, or anything like that. So their interests and what they like is a little different. So we are now going to see something very similar to that. Once again, we're going to find poetry, and it's also not. This is not T.S. Eliot. This is of the ballads sort, and it's a sort of look backwards too. It's not precisely modern. So let's look at some of these poems. King Pellinore is coerced into singing, and he sings or hums. He sings bashfully. Oh, I was born a Pellinore in famous Lincolnshire. Full well I chased the questing beast for more than 17 year, till I took up with Sir Gremor here in the season of the year. Since when 'tis my delight on a feather bed at night to sleep at home, my dear. It's a sort of precursor to the limerick. Not entirely, doesn't quite scan. But Pellinore has written it himself, which I think gives him great credit, right? That's the idea, is that these poetry recitings, you're not necessarily, I mean, they would sing popular songs, but they would also be encouraged to do a bit of skeletonics, right? Come up with their own stuff on the fly. Today we'd have a rap battle. But
Well, this also fits into the depiction of Pellinore as a kind of caricature of the British semi-aristocrat in India, right? And they all fancied themselves poets, and they were all Oxbridge men, and they did light verse and they did serious verse, and this is all in character entirely.
some of it was good, but most
Some
of
of
it
it.
was yes, small amount was good, and quite a lot of it was very bad, which is what happens when you copy, and you don't have a great deal of innovation. It's the anxiety of influence, is what Harold Bloom would call it, right? All those influences, they make you anxious and they cause you to not be very good in your copying. But some of them did great things, right? Fitzgerald, wasn't he an India man? He gave us fine translations. So let's see. We have some others as well. William Twitty is called for. Now, we've seen actually that he's shown up and he's treated rather perfunctorily at first, but with respect. But William Twitty reads a poem, and he reads it about himself. And it's a good one. D'ye ken William Twitty, with his jerkin so dagged? D'ye ken William Twitty, who never yet lagged? Yes, I ken William Twitty, and he ought to be gagged, with his hounds and his horn in the morning. And Ector loves this, because it's self-deprecating. And it shows that William Twitty is capable of laughing at himself. He's not actually some pompous, authoritarian, officious little martinet who's been sent by King Uther, who we have our first mention of in the last chapter, by the way. He's not been sent by King Uther to kind of crack down on Ector and make his life miserable. Actually, William Twitty is very much aware that people might not like him coming. And he's the perfect man for that job, because rather than, wield his power like a baton, he's actually there to be as professional as possible, but also to ingratiate himself and, not overwield his authority. And Ector loves it. Did you hear that, eh? Said he ought to be gagged, my dear feller. That's right. Well, Sir Ector gives us a bizarre rendering of something 20 verses. We only get one of them here. And it's about Wold King Cole. Now, I'm sure we've all heard about Old King Cole, but this is a fanciful and older version of it. Drew, would you like to read?
Oh, I think you ought to do it.
Oh, no, you would really must. This excessively hyphenated. Weon Wold King Cole was walking down to street. He saw a lovely lady stepping in a puddle. She lifted up her skeet for to hop across the middle. And he saw her ankle. Wasn't that a fuddle? He couldn't help it. He had to. and so, and so on. And we have 20, as we see, we're told we have 20 verses of this, in which Wold King Cole helplessly saw more and more things that he ought not to have seen, and everybody cheered at the end of each verse until, at the conclusion, old Rafe was overwhelmed with congratulations and sat down, smiling dimly, to a replenished mug of mead. And now Sir Ector gets up with his speech. It's the same speech. It's last year's speech. And it's also the speech from the year before. If you've got a good one, why variate it, right? Stick to it. Stick to the script. And this reminds me of Bilbo giving his speech, right, at his birthday party, where everyone's just prepared to cheer because they expect a formula, right? There's a certain formula to this. It's brief. You're going to thank everyone. They're going to cheer. You're going to name a few people. You're going to cheer for them. You're going to say how much you like everybody. You'll cheer for that, and then you'll be done. And Ector actually does stick to that script. Yeah, you don't disappear, and you don't give people really weird posers, in the form of rhetorical tricks. You just say what is straight and obvious. Hobbits like that, and so do the villains. And so that's what we have here. We have the cheers in parentheses. Tolkien does this, right? So, God bless King Pellinor, hear, hear. As long as this quest will stand up in front of him, hooray, etc. You, halloo, and several reed sheets blown in imitation. So they're all shouting, and there's audience participation. And Ector does sit down, and he does it without managing to disappear. And then they have the Vicar's Grace in Latin, which is still the national anthem today, handed down to us all the way from the time of King Uther. God save King Pendragon. May his reign long drag on. God save the
Wait. You have to sing it.
Oh, God, no, I don't think so.
King Pendragon, may his reign long drag on. God save the king. Send him most glorious, great and uproarious, horrible and onerous. God save our king.
Yay! Now the cricketers.
An 18th century tune, by the way.
Well, they have Uther singing it here, so it's all right. It must be from the time of Uther Pendragon, whenever that was, which might well be in the 18th century. And then they all leave, right? And so we have this beautiful. So here's a question: why does White give us this scene which doesn't really advance the plot, right? It gives us a little bit of character detail about William Twitty. But other than that, it's the sort of thing that a modern editor would say, you could lose this chapter, right? It doesn't really drive the plot forward. It's the exact sort of thing that's anathema to modern editors. So why does White give it to us? Why have this scene in the hall? Why have a feasting scene where nothing happens narratively?
Color. It adds, contextual color.
I think it sets up a bit of an emotional beat that pays off in the next chapter.
I entirely agree.
Gives you a chance to start to care about these characters. So if you put them in peril, or you give them some sort of hardship, you feel with them.
That's the thing.
It is an expression of the same kind of romanticism that we saw before, where he took the time to paint this idyllic picture of the countryside. Right? One of the things he's doing is he's writing what he likes to read, and he likes to read about this kind of romantic medievalism.
That's right, and I think that's one of the reasons we get these sort of like the little lists of things that are going on. We also see it like the inventories of rooms, right? White likes a lush description. And so he'll often begin his settings with a description of many events that are taking place simultaneously. Like what's happening in the autumn? Here's all the things that are happening in the autumn, right? What's in the room? Here's all the different things that are in the room. And the idea is to paint a picture for you before you move the characters onto the scene and have them move around in it. And that's particularly helpful if the scene that you're painting is one that doesn't exist anymore, which is how White views this past, right? There is something fictional about his ancient England. It's romanticized. But I think that...
It's all fictional.
I mean, They were casting from the right and the
Basically
left, right?
taking
That
little
is how
bits
you
of
do things. There are sickles, right? So it's not all fictional, but the manner in which it's presented is romanticized, right? So he's trying to create for you the factual setting of what it, what was involved in sowing a field, right, and bringing in a harvest, but also to do that in a way that reflects positively on it, rather than one which focuses on, what we would consider to be the inconveniences and difficulties of the period. Because, he
It's the
says, well,
same.
yeah, the villains lived in their one room house with their pigs and it was unsanitary, but they liked it.
It's the same kind of nostalgia that informs a lot of, especially the early bits of the Fellowship of the King or the Ring. The kind of Little England countryside nostalgia that Tolkien does is also what White's doing.
What's going on in the Shire, right? Yeah.
I was really curious about this, and I don't know if either of you have ever read Michael Moorcock's essay "Epic Pooh." And if you haven't, I recommend it. It is Michael Moorcock, famous British author, just taking the Mickey out of Tolkien. He really, really does not like Lord of the Rings. In fact, he calls the early parts of the Fellowship that Surrey of the mind. Just savages it, and I think he's unfair. As much as I like Moorcock, I think he's a little unfair to Tolkien. But I was curious why in that essay he doesn't pick up on White. And so I went back and I read it, and I read more of Moorcock, trying to find out if he ever said anything about T.H. White or the Once and Future King. And he doesn't in the essay, but he does mention at one point in time that he has enormous respect for White, because when he was a young author, he wrote to White, and White wrote back to him. And so he has, even though I think that these are essentially the sort of same over-romanticized country England, Michael Moorcock, the great curmudgeon, does not see them the same way at all. He finds White to be more honest than Tolkien was, for some reason. And I couldn't quite figure out that there, but I think that it comes down to when, as we said, White is writing this didactically. He's writing this for a political purpose, but you can tell that he really believes it and believes it strongly. And I think that's what Moorcock is reacting to, is that, I may not agree with this guy, but he's being honest with us. He's being honest with the reader. He's not trying to, snow anyone over or present something in a way that is anything less than his true and unvarnished feelings on the matter.
Well, I think
I would say that's probably true for Tolkien too. I mean, their politics, I don't want to get into details, but their politics are essentially the same. And they're both heavily influenced by nostalgia.
I think one reason you can look at White a little bit differently is because, first, his work is explicitly or almost explicitly didactic in a way that Tolkien's is not, although Tolkien does have particularly religious intentions behind his work. But the other thing is that White is willing to go into detail about the way in which things can go wrong in a way that Tolkien does not, right? When the Shire goes wrong, it's not because there are, admittedly some bad leaders in the Shire, which is what White says. He says, actually, there are some bad lords. There are wicked lords who are not like Sir Ector. And that is when the system goes wrong, and it allows those lords to remain in place. Unfortunately, the system does not provide a way to get rid of them. How do you get rid of them? You need King Arthur to come along and get rid of them. That's what you need. You need a legend. That's the only way to fix the system when it goes wrong. But in the Shire, there's no problems at all. The worst thing you have to deal with is Lobelia Sackville-Baggins comes along and your spoons fall into her umbrella, and she carries them off, right? That's as bad as it gets. So I think that White is a little bit more, willing to accept that, no, it's not a utopia. England isn't the Shire. England is England, and there are bad people in England. And unfortunately, although feudalism can be used to good ends, it can also be used by lords to bad ends. And when that happens, there's nothing you can do.
Yeah. And White also does, this is something I think that's similar to Tolkien's picture of the English countryside via the Shire, is that there are no riots or uprisings. That was a regular feature of
Yep.
feudalism. I mean, there was struggle between the peasants and the lords.
Sickness and plagues cause a lot of labor issues, right? And leads to the peasants' revolt and basically the death of feudalism. And that happens very early on. Well before Mallory. It was done and dusted. We think of Mallory. Mallory dies in the 1470s, 1479, I think. And the Morte d'Arthur is published a few years after his death in 1485. And we often think of 1485 as the end of the Middle Ages in England. Why? Because of Mallory? No, because 1485 is also the Battle of Bosworth. And Richard III is killed, and he's replaced by Henry Tudor. And that kind of ushers in the early modern period. But really, feudalism in England had died centuries before. It kind of dies in the reign of Richard II. We're talking in the 14th century. Why? Because of the plague, right? The plague comes along, it wipes out, a large number of the laboring classes, and suddenly laborers are in a position where they're in demand. And they hadn't been in demand before. And if you're in demand, that means you can, say, well, what about cutting the rent? What about actually paying me to work on your very big farm, right? Rather
I
than
want a
just giving me this
2-room
tiny little
cottage.
farm. And if hitherto, if you had said, because of, as Drew put out, because of basically rent equalization, if you had said, no, I'm not going to do that, then the villain would have no choice, and there's nowhere else he could go, right? But with labor being at a shortage, suddenly that changes. The villain can say, okay, well, I'm going to go down the road where the Lord down there has a better grasp of market conditions, and he's desperately in need of labor, just as you are, and he realizes that that's the situation, and he's willing to pay. And that's what happens. And it's Richard II who tries to put that all back in the bottle and say, no, you're not allowed to leave your land, and that leads to the peasants' revolt. So, and Wat Tyler and all that fine stuff. So we have to be aware that that's really the death of feudalism in England. It's the arrival of the plague. And as I say, that's centuries before Mallory. But depending on when you set the
And also the unique situation of a kind of unified state where you had demilitarized lords. I mean, that's why England's history looks so much different than France, because the Count of Anjou was as powerful as the king in Paris because he had his own army. So that too makes feudalism different in England. When I talk about this romanticism, I just want to clarify for the listeners, it's that erasure of all of the unpleasant bits that makes the picture romantic. That's what I'm saying when I say it's romanticism, is that it's just erasing anything that might be untasteful, like the peasant revolt, like plague, like all these real features of what living in that time really meant.
So if we could look at, since we're talking about unpleasantness, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually perfect, Drew. We're going to talk about the hunt. And there is some unpleasantness. And I would argue that the unpleasantness is romanticized. How do you romanticize unpleasantness? Well, you romanticize it in the same way you do the end of Old Yeller, right? It's romanticized unpleasantness. Or the, what's the one that everyone reads in 5th grade, where the red fern grows, about the dogs.
Yeah.
Right. So, or Johnny Tremain, the beginning of Johnny Tremain, if people still read that. I read that when I was a kid. So let's look. I'm afraid we don't have line numbers. All I have are page numbers, and of course that will differ depending on which version you're using. But this is in the last, or the standard hardcover edition. It's page 151. And we have the death of Beaumont. So I'll read this. I'll try not to cry. Master Twitty drew one leg slowly from under the boar, stood up, took hold of his knee with his right hand, moved it inquiringly in various directions, nodded to himself, and stretched his back straight. Then he picked up his spear without saying anything and limped over to Beaumont. He knelt down beside him and took his head on his lap. He stroked Beaumont's head and said, "Hark to Beaumont. Softly, Beaumont, mon ami. Oyez à Beaumont the valiant. Soif le douce Beaumont, soif, soif." Beaumont licked his hand, but could not wag his tail. The huntsman nodded to Robin, who was standing behind, and held the hound's eyes with his own. He said, Good dog, Beaumont the valiant. Sleep now, old friend Beaumont. Good old dog. Then Robin's falchion let Beaumont out of this world, to run free with Orion and roll among the stars. The wart did not like to watch Master Twitty for a moment. The strange, leathery man stood up without saying anything, and whipped the hounds off the corpse of the boar as he was accustomed to do. He put his horn to his lips, and blew the 4 long notes of the mort without a quaver. But he was blowing the notes for a different reason, and he startled the wart, because he seemed to be crying. Well, the mort is what is blown when the prey is down, right, dead. That's why it's called the mort. And this is, as I say, it's like the end of Old Yeller, right? So Robin has to kill Beaumont because Beaumont's back is broken. That's why he can't wag his tail. And we're given this picturesque way. But again, it's a romanticized unpleasantness. The specifics of what is going on are elided. Instead, we have a poetic sort of moving around the fringe, right? Robin doesn't kill him. Robin's falchion is what does it, right? Robin's falchion let Beaumont out of this world. It's a liberation, right? So how do we put this in the frame of romanticism, or how do we critique the romanticism of this Drew?
I don't know that I would say that it is romanticized. I mean, it's just a legitimately sad scene.
It is.
That White lets us feel.
It's a poignant trope. It goes all the way back to the Odyssey. In fact, this is very similar to the death of Odysseus's dog Argos, when he comes back disguised as a beggar. Nobody knows who he is, but when he passes by his, 20-year-old dog, right, just lying there, essentially unable to move anymore, the dog recognizes him immediately. And his ears lower, and his tail wags, and there's this moment of recognition, and Odysseus weeps, and Argos dies. So he waited for his master.
The death of animals is tough, right? When it's a pet. In literature, for some reason. Often even more than the death of heroes. Maybe because we're sort of inured to the deaths of heroes. They're supposed to die. That's what they do at the end. But you kind of expect the pets just to disappear out of the story. But that's not what happens with Beaumont. Remember, Beaumont is also a hunting hound. He's not a pet. It doesn't mean he's not a friend or he's not beloved, as we see, right, when Master Twitty is holding him and speaking to him. He's speaking to him almost as if you would speak to one of his soldiers dying on the battlefield, right? You did a good job, you've fought the good fight, you run the race correctly, now rest, basically. And so that's what we see here. I think this is why the wart is surprised to see him crying in the end. He thinks he sees it and he thinks soldiering, but then he sees the tear and he realizes no, there actually is real emotion behind it.
Yeah. If I were going to criticize the romanticism of it, it wouldn't be this picture in isolation, the tearjerker, but it's a genuinely pathetic scene in the literal sense. But it would be in the contrast to what kind of emotions White does want to evoke sympathy, right? The dying of the dog. And then what gets erased. And what gets erased is hardship on ordinary people in a feudal system, right? He wants us to like the feudal system. And so we're only focused on the elite and the way that they live their lives. And the death of their hunting dog is very sad. But, what's happening for the small people? Well, that's whatever.
Who also have animals and pets to worry about. Exactly.
Yes.
Living in their one-room cottages.
Exactly.
With their pigs and their cow called Crumbach. I've never in my life seen a cow called Crumbach. But it must have been a popular name going around at some point. Well, to counterbalance this, Pellinore and Ector come riding up because they've heard the mort. And I think it's interesting that they're not present. Actually, they don't participate in the death of the bull, right? It's William Twitty and Robin and Beaumont, and the wart is there too, incidentally. They are present for the final struggle, but Ector and Pellinore are not. They're off. They're in the wrong place. And I don't want to read too much into that, but I think that White is setting the scene for us because there's a sense in which Twitty and Robin and the wart, and Beaumont too, are worthy. They possess a certain kind of quality that Ector and Pellinore, and Kay for that matter, do not. And I don't really, Mallory would probably have called it prowess, right? That preeminent virtue in Mallory, which is the ability to wield arms. But I don't think it's that even. I think, Mallory would call it that, but I don't think that's what's going on here. But that's getting to it, right? That there's a sort of professionalism and, there's a certain prowess to the way in which they do things, right? Robin and Twitty are fearsome people. Not because they're scary, but because they can kill and they can do it very effectively. They don't do it gratuitously. They do it justly. And we see that here, right? Robin has to kill the dog. But the way in which he does it is a liberation. It's not brutality. Wart doesn't like Master Twitty in that moment. But then he realizes that actually Master Twitty is motivated by love, not by, foolhardiness that got the dog killed, or callousness that thinks you have to kill the dog, right? But it's actually a sort of professional way, a compassionate way of thinking about, how to handle an animal in this case. And Ector and Pellinore don't have that. And we can see
the Hegelian dialectic.
Well,
Lord and bondsman.
Yeah, the kinds of Englishmen they are that are parodied. This is where White is kind of like attacking that, right? You're saying, these kinds of Englishmen, the kind of Englishmen that is represented by Pellinore and Ector, they may be pleasant or even good people, but they're actually not the kind of people who can handle this sort of situation, right? They're not worthy to be there. And I wonder if that's because those are the kind of people like Ector and Pellinore, who were in charge of things during the Great War. And White is thinking about this, right? Who's really bearing the brunt of the Great War? Well, actually, a lot of people like Robin and Twitty and the wart, who are in the trenches and are just decent, upstanding, professional people. And they're going and marching out across no man's land and getting mowed down by machine guns every day. And who's calling the shots and organizing it? Who are the generals, 15 miles behind the lines with their drinks cabinets and their adjutants and their aides de camp? Well, those are people like Ector and Pellinore. And I wonder if this is in White's mind, and that's why we get this. So that's why I say worthiness. So that's not really the right word. I don't think we have a right word for the sense I'm getting. But they're not able to be there because they don't belong there in that moment.
Yeah, and he never kind of puts the pieces together. That it's always the personal morality of the individual agent, rather than seeing that people in that kind of position, in that kind of a system, are incentivized to act that way. Right? The system presses them in that direction. They're making what seem like rational decisions to them, but because of where they're placed in this kind of system, that's what it means for other people. So it's not so much about their individual. These are all fairly nice guys, right? Mm-hmm. But here we are. That's a very good point.
Well, I think that's particularly useful when we think about Ector and Pellinore, because they ride up and they're quite out of keeping with the moment, right? This is a serious moment. They had to kill one of their dogs. William Twitty is injured, luckily not seriously. They've blown the mort, and what happens? Well, up come Pellinore and Ector, and they're very, they're not serious. They don't treat the situation with serious because they weren't a part of it. So we've got them carrying on in their usual individual way, right? It's individualized. I'm glad you said that, Drew. You've got, Pellinor and Ector kind of carrying on and looking at each other and looking at it, and it's completely out of keeping with the moment, and that's why we have a break, not just a paragraph break, but an actual free line between the death of Beaumont and the blowing of the mort, and then everyone else. The mort brought most of the stragglers, I'm glad he uses that word too, stragglers up in due time. Sir Ector came next, whacking the brambles aside with his boar spear, puffing importantly and shouting, "Well done, Twitty! Splendid hunt, very! That's the way to chase the beast of venery, I will say. What does he weigh?" Right? Again, completely ignorant of the emotional resonance of what's going on. And I think we can say that that's individual, and that's right? We elide the system that incentivizes him to do that.
The juxtaposition here, there's a break in the text, but then the immediate following scene is a kind of contrast to this, because here we see Pellinor in a deep emotional situation vis-a-vis the questing beast. Well, here's how it goes. The procession moved off sedately in King Pellinor's direction, following his erratic course by the fresh tracks in the snow. The spectacle which they came across was one for which they were not prepared. In the middle of a dead gorse bush, King Pellinor was sitting, with the tears streaming down his face. In his lap there was an enormous snake's head, which he was patting. At the other end of the snake's head there was a long, lean, yellow body with spots on it. At the end of the body there were some lion's legs, which ended in the slots of a heart. It's the questing beast, and he's just completely, he's on his deathbed, really, because he hasn't been chased.
You've got to quest after the questing beast, or else it will go badly for everyone.
And of course, Pellinor then regrets his desire for a feather bed and being in the castle and participating in all of these things. What he should have been doing is devoting himself to the questing beast, who they take back to the castle to nurse him back to health. And Pellinor has a plan that once he is back to himself, then he'll let him go, give him a 2 hours head start, and chase him again.
The spirit of fair play, isn't it? Give him that 2 hour head start, and then we'll be off after you. It's only fair.
The juxtaposition of this sort of serious pathetic scene with this comedic pathetic scene, I think, is certainly not accidental.
No, and the hunt with the quest, right? Like, the hunt ends in death, and it's very serious. And here, I mean, in a sense, Pellinor has caught his quarry, but a quest is different than a hunt. You don't quest to kill the questing beast. You quest to find it. But you need to find it in the right circumstances. It's not on to find it because it got ill and then you're able to catch it. It's not fair, right? It's, again, that spirit of fair play. It's not a fair catch. It's not a fair cup, we would say, right? It's got to be done correctly. And that means the questing beast needs to be ready and able and willing to go. And also, again, another thing, the idea between the death of the boar and Beaumont does not affect Pellinor particularly at all. In fact, he's bent over the board and given a few smacks for using the wrong word. Oops. And that's upsetting and humiliating for him. But the illness of the questing beast leaves him disconsolate, and in fact actually causes him to assume authority, I think for the first time we've ever seen in the book, where he starts giving orders, and it's like, all right, then, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. And it's all very right and proper, but he has to be stirred into action. Otherwise, he's just generally kind of foolish and useless and backwards. But in a moment of peril, he's a good man to have around.
But he's stirred into action by something that seems to have no stakes. The hunt where the people got hurt, the dog gets hurt, right? There's real stakes there. Whereas here, his emotions are all about something that's seemingly unending and with no point. And I wonder if this is perhaps White commenting on the nature of British imperialism, which was in a sense on its last leg in the early 20th century. What was the point? What was the task? What were we trying to achieve? Well, you just grow the empire. You know,
it's that Monty
just keep
Python
doing it.
sketch where they're remembering the plaque of all those who died to keep China British, right?
Yes.
Like, well, but it isn't, and that didn't work. So I think you're absolutely right that the quest and the questing beast, they're not a figment of Pellinor's imagination, but they might as well be, right? They're real, but they also have, as you say, they're stakesless. They kind of only exist for him. They only have a point for him. And now that it's ill, he's very concerned about it. But it doesn't, you've got this giant thing, but nobody else seems to be remotely fazed by the fact that they found this thing that comes out of, looks like it belongs in the bestiary. And someone asked, I think it was on Twitter, or X, formerly Twitter, if we were going to talk about the bestiary. Because, of course, White wrote other books, and one of the things he wrote was a bestiary, a book of beasts, which is his translation of a medieval bestiary. And it was full of all sorts of things, camelopards and lions, but also fictitious things like chimeras. And we will talk about it, but I'm glad you brought up the description, because that really does fit neatly into the kinds of things he describes in the bestiary. And yet, this unusual, bizarre thing, nobody else is fazed. Of course, we'll carry it off to the castle and feed it and nurse it back to health and then give it a 2-hour head start. Of course, that's a perfectly natural thing to do. All right, well, in chapter 17, it's time for another dose of education. And there's a discussion first, before the education comes along, with Archimedes about birds. And the wart says, I'd like to be a bird again, because last time I didn't really get to do any bird things, is basically what this chapter boils down to. I just sat there and listened to the military birds talk about their military lives. Wouldn't it be nice to actually do bird things? And then we're given some time with Archimedes and then some time with the geese. And
we have a fun conversation about what's Archimedes' favorite bird.
Yes, bird racism from Archimedes.
He likes pigeons. Because
he thinks about it for a while and then says the pigeon, and then he's confronted about the fact that you must mean because you like to eat them. He said, I was leaving that out of it.
Well, if you ask me my favorite bird, I'd probably say, the initial thought is, well, probably chicken, right? Because it's delicious. Oh, well, okay. If we're not talking about eating, then maybe, cardinals or blue jays or something. Well, in any case,
then let me read this little description about the pigeon from Archimedes. It's quite amusing. The pigeon, said Archimedes, is a kind of Quaker. She dresses in gray, a dutiful child, a constant lover, a wise parent. She knows, like all philosophers, that the hand of every man is against her. She has learned through the centuries to specialize in escape. No pigeon has ever committed an act of aggression, nor turned upon her persecutors. But no bird likewise is so skillful in eluding them. She has learned to drop on a tree on the opposite side to man, and to fly low so that there is a hedge between them. No other bird can estimate a range so well. Vigilant, powdery, odorous, and loose-feathered, so that the dogs object to take them in their mouths. Armored against pellets by the padding of those feathers, the pigeons coo to one another with true love, nourish their cunningly hidden children with true solicitude, and flee from the aggressor with true philosophy, a race of peace lovers, constantly caravanning away from the destructive Indian in covered wagons. They are loving individualists, surviving against the forces of massacre only by wisdom in escape.
Well, you couldn't find a more romantic view of a pigeon if you tried. I think nothing has ever been written so romantic about a pigeon.
And I have to throw the Native Americans under the bus in the description, too. They're just an enemy. It's not like they're being persecuted and driven off their land. He also neglects the fact that pigeons are the way that they are because we bred them.
Yeah.
They're completely artificially created.
Well, I mean, it's like the dogs, right? That they were service animals, and then of course they become pets, and then they become objects of sort of veneration. And that's what's happening here with Archimedes. He's sort of venerating the created thing.
Yeah.
Well, this leads to the episode with the geese. And I always struggle with this 2-chapter section of The Sword and the Stone. I think of all the animals, to White, the geese were probably the most important. Because I think here is where we see, this is like his utopian vision. That if you want a peaceful world, a good world, then you need a world populated by geese, right? It's the geese that White, maybe Merlin gives Arthur as sort of a model. We've seen lots of negative models, right? Don't be like the pike in the moat. Don't be like the ants. Be like the geese. But I find it the hardest to understand of all of them, and the most incoherent.
Like White's political philosophy. It's sort of a hodgepodge of things that don't really fit together.
Maybe that's the thing, right? And so, and maybe there's a certain truth to that, right? That a political system created in the abstract to be as coherent as possible and as efficient as possible will never work in the real world. Where
That's a very Burkean position.
What's that?
It's a very Burkean position. I wonder if White was a Burkean.
Yes. So because you have to deal with human beings, and human beings are all very different, and their motivations are different, and sometimes their motivations don't make sense or are self-contradictory. And so you have to have a system that has some inefficiency, tolerance for inefficiency, and tolerance for contradiction, and tolerance for incoherence. And that means you end up with an actual system that works in the real world will be, to some degree, illogical and incoherent and contradictory. But it will work. Rather than, a perfect system that just breaks the moment you put actual human beings into it. So maybe that's what's going on with the geese. But I've always struggled with it because I prefer things to be neat and tidy. And the geese episode is not neat and tidy. That's the one thing it isn't. So let's look at it. It starts in the middle of a chapter, in the middle of chapter 18, and runs through the end of chapter 19. And I have a lot to say about the end of it, some of which I said already. But, well, let me see. What about there's so many different things. Let's look at one of their songs, because we got more poetry. We always want to stop for the poetry. They sing a song. Here's what it is. The vault of daybreak filled itself with heralds, and this is what they sang. You turning world, pouring beneath our pinions, hoist the horror sun to welcome morning's minions. See on each breast the scarlet and vermilion, hear from each throat the clarion and carillon. Hark the wild wandering lines in black battalions, heaven's horns and hunters, dawn bright hounds and stallions. Free, free, far, far, and fair on wavering wings comes answer albifrons, and sounds and sings. Well, it's actually, as far as poetry goes, not particularly bad. And I like the rhymes. I think they're very well done. Pinions, minions, vermilion, Carillion is particularly good. I like that. But unlike the everything not forbidden is compulsory of the ants, its meaning is not especially clear. And probably because it's got geese in it, it reminds me of the N. Scott Momaday poem, Angle of Geese, which evokes a similar idea, this sort of freedom, a world without boundaries, not a world devoid of hierarchy and power structures, but a world where those things are kind of sublimated. They're less opaque. I don't even know how to describe it. The idea of fighting is not foreign to the geese, but they think it ridiculous. If you have any experience with geese, then this whole idea is ridiculous because they're aggressive and nasty and they stink.
Yes.
I have strong view. I live in Michigan, so I have strong views on geese. We have to deal with them all the time because in the summer they fly over us to go to Canada, and in the winter they fly over us to go down south. And so they're always here, always, and they poop everywhere, and they're extremely noisy, and they'll camp out on any available green space, sward. And if you get near them, they'll run after you, and they will honk at you angrily, and they'll attack you. You have to be mindful. When I was a professor at Rochester University, they used to occupy the grounds, and I'd be walking to my office, and they'd be chasing me, trying to bite me. And I'd just put my arms out like this and go, ah! And then they'd run away because I look like a bigger goose if you do.
They like to remind us that they're the dinosaurs. They once ruled this earth.
Yes, now they rule the car park. It's obnoxious. Can't get to your car. Right? So there is a sense in which white's version of geese, maybe these are British geese, they're a little different, right? They're not like Canadian geese, who are not particularly Canadian in their aggressiveness. Maybe British geese are nicer. They're white probably, right? Because the Canadian geese are black with a white stripe, So they even look more militaristic. They're the fascist geese, I guess. They're Hugo Boss inspired clothing. Maybe British geese are nicer, but how do you square this? Like, they understand fighting. They even understand warfare. But then when the war talks to them about fighting, the stronger would have to knock down the weaker, basically. What if there were a fight? They call him a baby. That's like baby thinking. But I mean, that's ultimately, maybe I'm going to reveal myself as a closet fascist, but maybe that's ultimately all conflict is ultimately resolved when it becomes physical by the stronger triumphing over the weaker, right? Depending on how you characterize strength, right? So the wart is telling them a truth, when you get to the point where you're fighting, you've basically abandoned yourself to might makes right. And they say,
right, the point has to be to win at that point.
Yeah.
You hope that all those who are combatants believe in the justice of their cause, but at that point, the justice of the cause is secondary to the survival.
It's existential.
Yeah.
But I think that what is the name of the young female geese? Loliak, yeah. Loliak tells him at one point, she gets angry with him and says, "Will you stop it at once? What a horrible mind you must have. You have no right to say such things. And of course there are sentries. There are the gerfalcons and the peregrines, aren't there? The foxes and the ermines and the humans with their nets. These are our natural enemies. But what creature could be so low as to go about in bands to murder others of its own blood? I mean, that is really aimed right at humanity, right there. Is that humans are the only ones that make war for the sake of something so ephemeral as politics.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, expressing anti-imperialism, right? Defensive war is sometimes necessary, but imperialism is unprovoked aggression.
And maybe that's why she's able to understand the concept of sentries and guards in other races of birds, but not in the geese. Which makes the geese kind of like a little shire, right? This is White's shire. It's the world of the geese, where there is no war, and there are no bad leaders, and everyone is equal, and they don't even understand the idea of geese on geese warfare. They understand killing, but not internecine war, right? That's beyond their ability, and so the wart has to kind of explain it to her. The sentries asked, "Are we at war?" She did not understand the word war. "Are we fighting people?" "Fighting?" she asked doubtfully. "The men fight sometimes about their wives and that. Of course, there is no bloodshed, only scuffling to find the better man. Is that what you mean?" "No, I meant fighting against armies, against other geese, for instance." She was amused. "How ridiculous. You mean a lot of geese all scuffling at the same time? It would be fun to watch." And then, of course, the wart is surprised because he doesn't quite understand that. He's thinking scuffling, fighting, combat. Fun to watch them kill each other. To kill each other. An army of geese to kill each other. She began to understand this idea slowly and doubtfully, an expression of distaste coming over her face. When it had sank in, she left him. She went away to another part of the field in silence. He followed, but she turned her back. Moving round to get a glimpse of her eyes, he was startled by their dislike, a look as if he had made some obscene suggestion. Right? And then, of course, leading to what Lane read as well. What a horrible mind you have. How dare you say such things? The idea you could even conceive of this. So this is the utopian. Like, you could imagine the same thing if the hobbits began talking about forming armies to kill each other. Right, then this would be the reaction of them. They would be horrified by the mere idea.
The scouring of the Shire.
Yeah, well, that's eventually what has to happen, right? Tolkien at least gives us that. We never get a reckoning with the geese. The geese never go to war.
Right? Yes, but it's interesting. Tolkien doesn't seem to countenance the idea that industrialization that they end up rebelling against could happen from within the Shire.
Well, that's
it
the
has
thing,
to
yeah.
be
It has to come from outside.
Yeah.
Right. Sauron has to bring it in.
There's also here, I mean, I think the key is here at the very end. The wart says, "I like fighting. It's knightly because you're a baby."
Yeah, because you're
and I think this is sort of the key, because White, he's very Freudian, right? And he thinks that the root of imperialism is that people like to fight rather than economic motives. I mean, it is not simply because the British liked to fight that they built an empire, and nor was it an accident, as the famous saying goes. They have an accidental empire. Like, there were real economic motives behind the choices that were made. So it wasn't simply they liked to fight. But I think I get the idea that White thinks it's psychological, that they're addicted to fighting. They like it. They think it's fun.
Well, I mean, it's certainly true of.
There are people like that, but that's not the primary motivation behind imperialism.
No, absolutely not. Right. There are people who do like fighting and who enjoy being in combat, but they don't run the show, right?
No.
They show up when the fighting has begun. Someone else starts the fighting. It's not those sorts of people.
The Achilles.
Right. Yes.
Exactly. Well, we have one more thing before we wrap up. Unfortunately, we won't be able to read chapter 19 in its full potential, although it's mostly about flying around and seeing the world and the sort of unbounded freedom that the geese have, which I think
And this is the thing that this is the reason that Wart wants to be a bird again, because the thing he never got was to fly as a bird, and that's the fun of being a bird, is flying.
And now he gets it, right? And what is the fun of flying? Well, the fun of flying is to be free of the limitations of Earth, right? Of being stuck on the ground. And so that's what White gives us. This is why the geese don't really understand the ideas about boundaries, because when you're in the air, there are no boundaries. The idea of airspace hadn't yet been invented for White, so you can go wherever you want. You can see whatever you want, and you're allowed basically to do whatever you want, as long as you're not harming anyone. So you're up in the sky, and that is to be free of the constraints that are imposed on the world by things like an imperial system. But then, and this goes on for months, incidentally, the ward is with them for months, not hours, months. And we're told that that this is part of Merlin's magic at the beginning of chapter 19. There was something magical about time and space commanded by Merlin. Well, then he wakes up. And this is why I've said before that we always have to wonder to what degree these things are happening, right? Here's the end of chapter 19. "Well, Wart," said Kay in an exasperated voice, "do you want all the rug? And why do you heave and mutter so? You were snoring, too." "I don't snore," replied the Wart indignantly. "You do." "I don't." "You do. You honk like a goose." "I don't." "You do." "I don't. And you snore worse." "No, I don't." "Yes, you do." "How can I snore worse if you don't snore at all?" Good point, actually. By the time they had thrashed this out, they were late for breakfast. They dressed hurriedly and ran out into the spring. Well, there, right? So, is it a dream? I mean, I think there we see the clearest example. But White does this, he mixes it up. We do get a sense in some earlier sections that, as some of the readers pointed out, that he actually was there. Why weren't you in your bed, right? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was a bird. He just wasn't in his room. So I think we do need to consider the possibility that, the wart isn't literally being turned into an animal.
Right.
Although Merlin in Mallory can change the way that people look. So, it's not outside of his power, but I think he's not actually a bird, certainly.
But does he change their shape, or does he change how they're perceived?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? I don't recall exactly how Mallory puts it, but I think it's probably a matter of perception. Yeah, you can make people see you as the Duke of Cornwall.
So it's an illusion rather than a metamorphosis.
Exactly. Uther doesn't become the Duke of Cornwall. He just appears to be the Duke of Cornwall. All right. Well, that is it for this week. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode on the third of our 4-part series on the Sword and the Stone, and the third part in our 14-part series on the Once and Future King. Next week, we will read the conclusion of the Sword and the Stone, and we will handle your comments 2 weeks from now in our first episode on Book 2. So please do send in your comments. We will be sure to read them. If you'd like to support us, you can go to criticalreadings.com and click Become a Patron at the top of the page. That will give you access to our Discord channel with early access to the podcasts, access to our chat rooms and our message forums, the ability to vote on our Reader's Choice episodes, and more, including live streaming of the podcast. So do consider joining us. Your support makes sure that all of our episodes remain online and ad-free for everyone. Thank you to all those who support us. Your names are in the credits. And thank you also this week to Dr. Drew Nathaniel Keene.
It's been a pleasure.
Lane Haygood.
Goodbye, as always.
And to all of our supporters. We'll see you next week. Until then, from all of us here at Critical Readings, Godspeed.